Let them eat cake. Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my masculine feminine energies film breakdown series with the 2006 film Marie Antoinette. If you're not familiar with what I mean by masculine feminine energies, I have a ton of videos on this content, but a brief summary. Masculine and feminine energies are energies live within all of us. We all contain both energies. We all have a core energy. This is when we're most ourselves in. The energy often links up with our gender. It doesn't have to, but it very often does. We can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies, and each of these energies contains archetypes, and we all contain all of the archetypes within us that we can tap into whenever we need to. I have a ton of videos about the masculine and the feminine archetypes if you want to learn more. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine and one partner to be in the feminine, because opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So let's talk about Marie Antoinette. I am reviewing the 2006 version. It was requested. I have seen this movie before. Aesthetically, I love it. Like, aesthetically, this movie is, the best word I can come up with is decadent. It is just an absolutely, like, aesthetically stunning film, especially if you were into girly glamour, French country, which I obviously am. This particular story of Marie Antoinette really does show her transitioning through so many of the different feminine archetypes, so I really want to focus on the feminine archetypes in this video. I have a lot of videos about the feminine archetypes. My original one was actually a breakdown of Elle Woods from Legally Blonde, which to me, she's kind of like the epitome of the woman that has all of the archetypes. I've also talked about them in Wonder Woman, a lot of the wounded archetypes in Sex and the City, but it has been a while since I have done a video focusing on the feminine archetypes, so I was excited to break down this film. So that's primarily what I'm going to focus on. The beginning of the movie, Marie Antoinette is being sent from her home in Austria in this arranged marriage to marry the future king of France. And she's very much a maiden. She actually retains a lot of maiden energy throughout a lot of the movie. It's not actually said in the film, however, historically, and I don't really know exactly how historically accurate all the storyline is. I'm not a historian, but I do know that Marie Antoinette was actually 14 years old when she married Louis XVI, who was 15 years old. So one thing we have to remember when we're talking about this young couple, they were children. Like, they were promised to each other and married off to each other when they were children. And Marie is very much in this maiden energy. She's got her, like, her girls around her, like her ladies in waiting that she has to say goodbye to at the French border, and she has to give up her puppy, Mops. Oh my god, that was so heartbreaking. Like, she was sad about letting go of everybody, but when they basically, like, made her give up her dog, the heartbreak, I mean, it's just a little girl being separated from her puppy. So she basically goes through this transition where in order for her to, like, cross the border into France, she has to release everything from her past life and step into her new life, which is kind of supposed to be symbolic of her stepping from her maiden into her queen, essentially. I mean, she's stepping into the role of future queen. The thing is that all that symbolism is all beautiful, but the transitions that we have here, particularly when we're talking about the feminine archetypes, it needs to happen within. And she doesn't really step into her full queen yet because all she did was change her clothes, right? She had to say goodbye to her old life, but she hadn't really fully stepped into womanhood, really, into her new life yet, and doesn't for a while. So, you know, she's really transitioning from that maiden, and she's kind of being thrown into her queen, but she's not really ready for that yet. So she meets Louis XVI, and they are promised to each other. They're very awkward with each other, but it's interesting how everybody is so formal, but I love that Marie Antoinette is a hugger. Like, she's so quick to hug people, and it's funny how they reference Austrians being so cold in all of the gossip that goes around the palace, but, like, in reality, she is so warm and loving, and that's a big maiden thing. It's just sort of like that, like, I'm just gonna hug you. Like, I want to hug you, and I want to embrace you, and, like, that kind of, like, wide-eyed, excited innocence to her. Oh, it's such a beautiful quality, and I know there's a lot of people who believe that, you know, you are the maiden in youth, and then you transition into being a mother, and then you transition into being like a wise woman. Some people call it a crone. I prefer to call it a wise woman. And, like, those are the stages you go through in life as a woman. I believe that you can really embody any of those archetypes in any life stage you're in. I really do believe that having that maiden within you at every stage of your life is beautiful. Having that, like, wide-eyed, you know, open to the world, excited about life energy, I think can be really beautiful in a woman of any age. You can also tell too that, like, as she's entering the palace, The small children are giving her flowers. She definitely feels more comfortable around the children because she's still a child herself. You know, she's not really a grown adult yet. She's being thrown into this like adult environment. And this was a different time period. This was how things were done. This was royalty, so it was a very specific path that they had to follow. And in reality, as young as they were, Louis XVI was next up for king. His grandfather was the king at the time, and he was next up for king, so they needed him to get married and to start having kids as soon as possible. I'm not agreeing with the mentality. I'm just saying that that was the custom at the time. We're talking about a 14 and 15-year-old. It's really creepy when they actually have their wedding and then they're like escorted together in like their wedding bed. And the fact that they have like a priest and the family and everybody is like hovering around them and like blessing the bed so that they'll have a lot of children, and it's just like all these people there and are all like monitoring whether or not they're having sex and things like that. I mean, if you think about that kind of pressure, I mean, and they're children. Like they're children and they're basically being told to like get in a bed together and like make babies. While that does happen, like there are people that young who are doing that when they're not being told to do that. That kind of pressure and strain on two young people in a relationship, I mean, you can kind of see why Louis is actually not really able to perform. They say there's something medically wrong with him. I think like historically there are rumors as to what some of the reasons were. Some people believe it was a medical issue why he was not consummating their marriage. Some people believe it was because he was actually gay. They don't really get into that in the movie, so that's not really a key part of the movie. However, he is really being very cold, and Marie Antoinette is basically like, okay, we're supposed to do something, we're supposed to do this, and she doesn't really know what to do. I mean, they're kids, right? I would also note that, I mean, Marie Antoinette is clearly a very feminine being at her core. She is just so feminine naturally. This actually came up in my Roman holiday breakdown with Audrey Hepburn, is when somebody is a naturally feminine core being, an overly structured life is going to be very draining on them. You saw that in Roman Holiday. Audrey Hepburn was a princess and she kind of like breaks down and needs to escape because like everything is so structured. Marie Antoinette has a very similar experience, although she doesn't run away, but everything is so structured. She even says at one point that like what's happening is ridiculous. Like it's so structured and formal. And when you're a feminine core being, that level of formality is going to be so draining on you. I think you see it too in this moment where they all go to the opera, and which is a common theme in a lot of the breakdowns I've done about women who are in their feminine. Pretty Woman, Moonstruck. There's a couple others that I've done that have like opera scenes. Phantom of the Opera, obviously. That's kind of a common theme. And, you know, Marie is so intoxicated by this opera and she starts clapping because she's so excited. And everybody's sort of like, oh, clapping isn't permitted. I think it was like the royal showcase or something like that, because it was royalty, clapping wasn't permitted. And she was just like, are you kidding me? No, we're gonna clap. And she gets up and she gets everybody clapping. And it's interesting because Louis gets really kind of enamored with her in that moment, you know, because she's fully expressing her feminine. She's being fun, she's being playful. Like that's that warmth and excitement that's so magnetic. Like that level of feminine openness, playfulness, joy, excitement, that is magnetic. Like she gets the entire room full of people clapping because that level of just like feminine energy is just, it's radiant, it's magnetic, and that's such a beautiful scene. I love that scene. Now what ends up happening is Marie ends up transitioning from her maiden to connecting to her lover energy, which is great, except that her lover energy becomes very wounded. Now the lover energy is actually not just sexual, it is about joys, pleasures, just enjoying the pleasures in life. But when that energy gets very wounded, it tends to come out as addictions. And Marie really has like all the addictions, like all of them. That's really common when you are in your maiden archetype. Like that's your overwhelming archetype. You haven't really tapped into any of your other archetypes yet. You start tapping into your lover because your maiden doesn't really have a lot of self-control. Like your maiden is just all about loving life. And then when your lover energy kicks in, and your lover energy is just like, hey, joys and pleasures in life. And when you only end up in that maiden and lover energy and you don't have your other archetypes to to kind of help you balance those out. Very often you get into very overindulgent and some often self-destructive behaviors. That's where you start getting into wounded feminine energy. So they don't have the ability to actually know when indulging in pleasures is actually a good thing or a bad thing, and they don't actually know when enough is enough, like when they've had enough. They don't have that signal that tells them to stop. Also too, I mean, I think that a basic kind of psychological assessment would be that Marie's not getting any sex from her husband, so she's kind of trying to find those pleasures somewhere else. But Marie is a young girl, and she doesn't really know that she's missing sexual energy from her husband. She hasn't really experienced that yet. So really what this is a response to the fact that here's this very, very naturally feminine core being who is being forced to have all of this masculine structure around her. She's being discouraged from really having any kind of basic pleasures or joys or excitement in life. She has so many people. She has the entire palace who is talking about the fact that she's not producing an heir, which is her job, and if she doesn't do that, then she may end up in trouble. She has her mother and her brother coming to her saying, like, you know, you need to seduce your husband. Like, you need to figure out, like, imagine like a 14-year-old girl, she needs to know how to seduce her husband in order to get her pregnant. I mean, like, that's something that in modern day times, it's hard to even fathom. Use your charms. It's like, she doesn't know what that is. You know, she's a girl, she's a little girl. You know, so the idea that she's having all this pressure, like, it's literally the pressure of an entire bloodline and a pressure of an entire country that is being put on this young girl who is feminine at her core. So she really is somebody who desires to be in flow, and she's got this structured life. Everything is so intense and all this pressure, and her mother literally tells her in a letter, like, the job is on the woman, like that all of the pressure is on her to make everything work. She snaps. She ends up basically using her addictions as a way to escape, which is so common nowadays. And you see this in men and women. The overspending, the food addictions, which I find very interesting, that she's got all of this overindulgence in food, yet somehow the actress does not gain a single ounce, even after having kids. Go figure, right? She gets involved with gambling. There's some scenes that kind of imply that she's doing some kind of drugs and stuff, which I don't even know if the drugs that they were showing are even actually things that existed in that time period. I don't know. I don't really know how historically accurate this is. Partying, you know, the drinking, the food, the overspending, the gambling, all of those things. And you can even add, like, in modern day terms, porn addictions, video game addictions, things like that. Like, all of those things are escapes, right? It's escaping into the pleasure. Now, as a feminine being, it is natural for her to want to enjoy the pleasures in life. But when anybody starts to use those pleasures in life as an escape, that's where wounding starts, and that's usually where addiction starts. And that really is the gist of this whole thing. It's really the gist of Marie Antoinette's downfall, is really her addictions. She's so caught up in her addictions because as a feminine being, she is put into this masculine structured world, and all of the pressure is being put on her. And you see this nowadays. I mean, obviously this is like over the top. This is a glamorous way of showing addictions, right? But you see this a lot in our modern day society, where you have young girls. I mean, we expect young girls to grow up younger and younger every year. It's unbelievable. And I mean, younger and younger girls are actually getting pregnant and having babies, becoming single mothers. We put so much pressure on young girls to succeed in higher and higher education, corporate worlds that are very structured to be very masculine. And when you put girls into these environments and you tell them, hey, you have to have all the structure and discipline, then as mothers, we kind of have this idea of micromanaging a household, the idea that even if you are a stay-at-home wife and mother, that you basically have to mother your husband, like all the responsibility of the entire household falls on you. So we're putting more and more pressure on women. Oftentimes, even when they are stay-at-home wives and mothers, they're also working a full-time job. So they're having to do the masculine structure of working and run their home from a very masculine place, and more pressure gets put on women, which is why you see so many women going through burnout nowadays, the increase in anxiety and all kinds of health issues, mental and physical health issues in women. Women have more burden on them than they ever have before, and that's why you're seeing a lot of women that fall into the overspending. I mean, we live in such a overly consumer society. It's like these moms that have to go out and they go to like Target or something and they buy like everything in the store. Like they have to like revamp their home. Now, going to a store and, you know, getting things to freshen up your environment, changing up your environment, changing things around, changing the aesthetic of things, updating things, like those things are all very feminine. But when they start to become so overindulgent and they're being done as a distraction from the things that you're missing in your life, or as an escape from the pressures of your life, or as your only outlet for connecting to your feminine energy, that's where things start to go wrong. You know, you see it also too with a lot of the moms that are like, you know, they need to end the day with a glass of wine, or it's like they'll have like the glass, it's like mommy's juice or something like that, when it's just like a whole big glass of wine. That's often a drinking problem. And it's often a sign of an addiction. I mean, I know we have a kind of very extreme idea of what an addiction is, but like if you need alcohol in order to get through your day, that's a problem, right? And I'm not saying that you can't ever have a drink or something like that. However, if you're using these outside things to escape your life, you're better off working on your life and actually figuring out how to create a life that you don't feel like you have to escape from. And you see this with men too. I mean, I talk about this in a lot of other videos. I'm just going to focus specifically on women in this case because I am talking about the feminine archetypes, and this is a very girly movie. But you do see this activity in men too. Porn, video games, big escapes for men today, marijuana use, those kind of things. Drinking as well. A lot of those things are escapes that men use to escape their life. And anytime you find yourself using an escape or something that you're trying to escape from and it starts to slip into an addiction, that's where you really have to worry. And in Marie Antoinette's case, it really is her downfall. Now, Marie finally gets pregnant, and after long suffering with all of this pressure on her, she has a little girl, which in those days in royalty, having a daughter really meant nothing. It's a really sweet scene that she has with her new baby. She says to her, basically, she knows that she wasn't what everybody was expecting, but had she been a boy, she would have been the son of France. But since she's a girl, she gets to be all hers. And in that moment, you really do see Marie transition into motherhood. Now, they actually take the baby away to the nurse, essentially, to nurse the baby, and Marie really wants to do it herself. They kind of want to let her. It's very structured. It's very like, she's like, I want to raise my daughter, and they're kind of trying to keep her away from doing that. So the king ends up giving Marie this sort of like country home. And that's really where she starts to tap into her other archetypes, because she has more freedom now. She's got this country escape. That's where she taps into so many other aspects of herself. Now, she taps into her mother energy. She's so loving with her daughter. Oh my God, the scene where Marie Antoinette and her daughter with her like blonde curls, and they're like feeding a little baby lamb. And I was like, oh my God, I swear to God, my uterus jumped. It was unbelievable. I was like, oh my goodness. One note I will make about the mother archetype is that you don't actually have to become a mother in the traditional sense of actually giving birth to a baby in order to step into your mother archetype. In fact, some women go through the experience of having a baby and don't tap into their mother archetype, and some people can tap into their mother archetype long before they have children, or even if they don't have children. But oftentimes the transition to connect to your mother archetype can happen when you give birth, because you start to learn how to care for another human being. And in this particular case, Marie does tend to tap into that a lot. She's really getting back to earth and nature. She's kind of, you know, has her chickens, and she's actually collecting the eggs, and she's taking care of all the animals, and she's got the garden. She's really tapping into her wild woman at that point. Like, she's, you know, playing in the grass. She's growing things. She's gardening. She's growing herbs. She's, you know, growing different fruits and things like that. Like, she's really tapping into her wild woman. There's actually a really interesting scene too where she's there with a whole bunch of her friends, which it becomes this kind of like community of these other young women, and they're kind of all having a lot of fun, and they're actually having this party with some men there and things like that, and they all start using like their finger around the rim of the glasses as like sound bowls, and they're like, wow, this is spiritual. Like, they're literally tapping into their spirituality, which back in that time in France with, you know, religious ceremonies and things like that, like that kind of spirituality, witch energy, would not really have been accepted in that time period. So that wild woman in her is something that would have been very taboo in that time period, especially for a queen to be like digging in the dirt and playing in the dirt with her daughter and her friends, and kind of having this very like, it's kind of like a witch coven, you know what I mean? Like having that experience would have been very taboo in that time period. She also was doing a lot of reading. She's a really beautiful quote. I don't remember the actual quote, but she was reading about, you know, the idea of industries and things like that, and she's doing a lot more reading and stuff, so she's really tapping into her wise woman, tapping into her wisdom or intuition. And then as the movie goes on and France is not doing well, everybody is blaming Marie Antoinette for her overspending, for the reason why everybody is poor and there's like a bread shortage. They imply in the movie that the line that she said of "let them eat cake" was actually kind of almost like a tabloid thing. Like she didn't really say it, like it was them, like essentially the media trying to portray her as being a brat and stuff, and I don't know how historically accurate that is at all. But as she's going through this transition and people are now starting to dislike her, she's having to learn to tap into her other energies. And I would say, you know, she really taps into her queen and her huntress. She's back at the castle and she keeps saying like, my place is with my king, my place is by my king. She is stepped into this energy of, I'm here for the family, we're a family unit, we're gonna stand together. And basically when the guards come in and say that they're coming to kill the queen, and you know, this angry mob is basically overthrowing the palace and stuff, she's like, you know, okay, get the children. She stays calm, she jumps into action. Like that's her huntress energy. Like, and in the end she is bowing down to her people, her the angry mob that are coming to raid the castle. So she's stepping into that queen where she's actually, even though she's been queen for a while, she actually was initiated into the actual role of queen. She really steps into that, unfortunately, at the end when she basically bows down to the angry mob, which essentially is her way of acknowledging something greater than herself, which is similar to the masculine stepping into his king. It's actually like having to answer to something greater than yourself. In that case, it was her country. And also valuing the role of standing with her family, of taking ownership of what her part in this story was, of taking ownership of her part in life, and actually saying, okay, this is my fate, I'm gonna accept my fate. Like that was really her version of stepping into her queen. It was really interesting to see her transition through all of the feminine archetypes as the film goes along. Some wounded, some not. I mean, if she had stepped into her queen and really thought about her country as a whole, as opposed to the overspending, the overindulgence, would things have gone differently? Who knows? She does end up having a son. She has 2 sons, but one of them doesn't survive. So she does have a son, and it's interesting how when she has her son, it's like, well, that's when she's seen as being of service to her country. Like that was what she was asked to do for her country, was simply to produce an heir. Like that was really her role in being there, and she really did that for her country. The way it's portrayed in the movie, if you really look at it, she really did have to sacrifice herself, because she kind of became a person that everybody hated because of this obsessive need to please everybody, which is another sign of wounded feminine. Because she is such a feminine character, it's not that surprising that she would end up in a lot of wounding, because again, this constant need to please the people around her, to be the thing that people around her wanted her to be, which essentially was the mother of an heir. She really did sacrifice herself. She really did become, you know, addicted to everything around her. And it was kind of interesting that the stuff that she was really doing for other people ended up being the thing that really ended up making her destroy herself, which I think is probably pretty common in a lot of women today. You hear that story over and over and over again, where women try so hard to please everybody else that they kind of end up destroying themselves in the process. Now granted, the way that Marie Antoinette destroyed herself was pretty glamorous, don't get me wrong. However, she was still destroying herself. I mean, the gambling, the drinking, the overeating, the obsessive addiction with shopping and the pleasures in life was really her downfall. And for most people, it would take a lot less than what she was indulging in to actually destroy somebody in like a regular setting who wasn't royalty living in Versailles. So this movie was primarily about Marie Antoinette and, you know, the story of her life transition and her archetypes and what she went through and how she transitioned was the primary part of the film. But I do want to make a note about a couple other characters. First of all, her relationship with Louis XVI. You don't really dive into him too much. He is a masculine character, I would say, although he is still a boy, so he really hasn't fully transitioned into manhood. That said, he does have a very masculine mind about him. You know, he's very into things being for a purpose, which is a very masculine mindset. He goes out hunting, he has a ritual. Hunting is very masculine in general. You don't have to hunt in order to be masculine, but the act of going out and hunting, and especially the fact that he has this ritual of going out hunting, and his ritual, his, you know, that kind of thing, like the masculine will thrive in that. The feminine can go crazy if she's too much structure and too much of a ritual, whereas the masculine will often thrive. That's why so many men write books about having a morning routine, because that morning routine can be really great for a masculine being, whereas a morning routine will often work for a feminine being for a short period of time, and eventually it's probably gonna bore her to tears, wear her out, because that kind of masculine ritual is not the best thing for a feminine being. Not saying that as a feminine being that you can't have some kind of a ritual or routine for your life, because I mean, it's good for anybody to have some kind of structure, but if as a feminine being your life is too structured, you're probably not going to thrive in that. It's going to start to feel really constricting, whereas the masculine can thrive in structure, and Louis really does. It's also interesting too, as much as he is obviously not very comfortable with opening up with his lover energy, as him and Marie actually start to get to know each other as they get older, they do have a sweet relationship. It's not really something that is overly polarized, especially considering the fact that she is so feminine and he is definitely masculine at his core. They never really fully come together. Like, they're always kind of there together out of obligation. I mean, it does appear that a love develops between the two of them, but they don't really have a lot of chemistry together. It's interesting, on her 18th birthday party too, he's kind of wants her to end things, doesn't want her to keep gambling, he wants her to rein in her wild indulgences, because he doesn't really understand that. For him, he likes the fact that things are structured and things are aligned. Her wounding is a bit too much for him. And when a masculine man is very overly structured, like overly everything has to be just so, if he is a feminine being who starts to get into wounding and stuff and starts to get overindulgent and doesn't have any self-control whatsoever, that's gonna make him feel very unsettled, and especially if he's somebody who's young and doesn't really know how to handle the wildness of the feminine. It's probably gonna cause a disconnect. In his case, he shuts down, so he kind of like backs off and pushes her away a bit, which isn't totally uncommon. Sometimes the masculine can then get into a need to control her. In this sense, that didn't really seem like that was what he was doing. He was more like, okay, I'm just gonna keep us separate. I'm gonna kind of keep her wildness and craziness kind of like off to the side, so I don't really have to deal with it. That was his way of dealing with it. But it's interesting because she's like, I want to watch the sunrise. Don't you want to watch the sunrise? And he's like, well, I mean, I do when I get up and go hunting. Like, that's the thing about the masculine. Like, the masculine will do things typically out of like a greater purpose. Like, there's a purpose to something. Like, if he's watching a sunrise, it's because he's going out to do something specifically. Whereas the feminine wants to watch the sunrise just for the sake of watching a sunrise. Like, the beauty and joy of things, the pleasures in life, are reason enough. She doesn't need a specific purpose to stay up all night and then watch the sunrise in the morning. She doesn't need there to be a greater purpose other than just wanting to experience that. Like, the feminine is about life and life experiences, where the masculine usually will have a structure and purpose to things. So I thought that was really interesting, because in that moment you see how different they are. Like, she's like, I want to watch the sunrise for the sake of watching the sunrise, and he's like, well, no, but we have a structure, we have a routine, like, this is how things have to go. And it shows a big difference in their masculine and feminine. But I think it's also an example of the fact that you can have two people in their masculine and their feminine energies, but they're not embodied in a healthy version of them. Like, he's not actually in his masculine enough to know how to handle the wild chaoticness of a wounded feminine, whereas you have a wounded feminine woman who just does not know how to rein in any of her feminine in order to keep it from destroying her. Her chaoticness and his structure, I mean, it's not to say that they couldn't be attracted to each other in that case, but you have a wounded feminine and he's more grounded in his masculine. They're not coming together, right? Because her wounding is a bit too much for his masculine. There's also a moment, I would say too, where at the end, when they kind of are storming the castle and Marie is there and she's holding the two kids, when they actually start breaking in, like, Louis jumps up and he is like, the instinct of it, like the way that he jumps up and is like guarding his wife and children, that's straight up masculine right there. Again, this is not a large, powerful man at all. It's that instinct in that moment. It shows his masculine in that moment. Like, he you know, as much as they've been through and as complicated as things are with the two of them, when the moment comes where his family is threatened, he jumps into action. Like, that's a very masculine moment right there. Like, his instinct to protect right there is really, really, it's a subtle moment, but it's actually a really poignant one. I also think too, in the very final scene, when they're basically in a carriage and they're leaving Versailles, and Louis makes a comment to Marie about, are you taking one last look at everything? Like, kind of assuming that she's in her feminine indulgence. And she says, no, I'm saying goodbye. I think that's actually really symbolic too of the fact that Louis has always seen her as, again, this feminine being who's up for joy and pleasure. And in that moment, she's acknowledging an end. The feminine doesn't like endings. The feminine does not like things to end. She likes things to continue. I feel like that was very symbolic of her almost like saying goodbye to her feminine energy, of her saying like, okay, my feminine has not been good to me. It's what got me in this situation. And like, that was the moment where she put her guard up and like ended things and said goodbye. I think that can happen when women get into very wounded feminine energy, where their overindulgences and things can actually get them into a lot of trouble. It can actually cause them to not trust their feminine energy, so then they'll shut that down. It did feel to me very symbolic of her kind of saying that her feminine was what got her into this mess, because it really was her overindulgences, which that wasn't really her true feminine, that was her wounded feminine, because she wasn't actually fully embodying all of her feminine energy. So she was using a lot of these overindulgences as a distraction from actually being the full feminine being that she really truly was and truly could have been. Like, not really stepping into that queen energy that was really what she needed to be for herself, not just for her family and not just for her country, but for herself. She really never fully transitioned out of wounded maiden, wounded lover energy that she had, and she didn't really know how to really have that queen, the huntress, the wise woman, the wild woman. She didn't really know how to make those things all help her to transition into the regal queen that she really needed to be, that all of us feminine beings can be. When you actually get like all of your archetypes kind of at their best and really healed and really comfortable in all of your archetype energy, that's usually the moment that you can, as a feminine being, step into your own true queen. Now, she has an affair with a count who is a Swedish soldier, played by Christian Grey, I might add, and nobody does a masculine stare down like that man, let me tell you. He has such a presence and an intense focus that gets so focused on Marie, and you can really see why those two have such sexual polarity. You don't dive too much into his character, but he has such a masculine presence about him. Even in like the chaos of the scene at the country house where he kind of comes to her party and stuff, he is so focused on her. And even with all the chaos and everything, like, the thing about a masculine man, when his focus can stay on a feminine woman throughout the chaos, like, he can keep that focused presence, which you often see in people that have the training and skills to actually be a soldier or something like that. Like, somebody who has a very masculine profession, you can very often see that ability to stay focused in the chaos, because that's part of what it takes to be a good soldier. The fact that he can focus so much on her. Now, they don't dive into the character too much, and you kind of get the impression he's a bit of a womanizer, so I'm not going to say he's the perfect man or anything, but you can see where somebody like him would be then attracted to somebody like Marie, where, especially if he's kind of a womanizer, so he's maybe in a bit of his masculine wounding, so he's kind of uses his masculine to use people, why he would be drawn to somebody who actually is somebody who is in her wounded feminine, who is using her feminine energy to kind of abuse herself. If you have a wounded masculine and a wounded feminine, they're going to polarize together. Whereas if you have someone who's more of a grounded, healthy masculine, a wounded feminine might entice him, but it's probably not going to align with him exactly. So the fact that this count is supposedly a womanizer, him being attracted to somebody who's kind of using her feminine to abuse herself, it kind of makes sense why they would come together. They have some pretty heated, steamy polarity, and I think that that's where Marie starts tapping into this overindulgence of her sexual energy as well, because it's not something she's really had with her husband, because he really hasn't been able to tap into his sexuality. They've slept together so that they could actually reproduce, but that was the point of it. But they never really have that sexual chemistry, because they really weren't together because they actually chose each other, because they were actually attracted to each other. It was all a formality. And, you know, back in those days, that did often happen when you had arranged marriages, which is actually why I want to make a note about kind of an interesting side storyline that happens. The king at the beginning of the movie, who is Louis' grandfather, has a mistress, Dubarry. And she is presented as this very kind of like trashy woman. Like everybody's gossiping about her because she's like the mistress. She's, you know, they say she's from a whorehouse. She's this and that, whatever. She's not considered like the elegance of royalty, but she's the king's favorite. The king favors her, and he's done everything to have her there, to have her with him. She entertains him. Like, she's very entertaining to him. As much as she is, you know, shunned by everybody, and so she's a bit of a loner, she's very much connected to her feminine energy, her darker feminine energy. Like, she's definitely got that kind of like seductress to her, but she's there for the king. She's always by the king's side. She is, you know, loyal to the king. She amuses the king. She is kind of giving him a reason to live, giving him a reason to wake up in the morning. She is invigorating his sexual energy. Now, the king is a bit lecherous, so I'm not gonna say that he's like the greatest guy in the world or anything. She's open to receiving from him. As much as she's shunned by everybody, even Marie, because Marie is kind of like, oh, she's the mistress, so they're just kind of assuming she's bad. Now, I think part of the reason why Marie and Dubarry don't really get along is that I think Marie, especially at her young age, with all this pressure for her to be sexual, sees this woman who is fully embodying her sexuality. And that's the reason why most of the women don't like her, is essentially because she's fully embodied in her sexuality. She doesn't appear to be sleeping around with everybody. She's sleeping with the king, but she is the mistress. I don't endorse like mistresses, other women, infidelity. I don't endorse any of that at all. But what I'm saying is, if you look at her energy, her sexual energy, her feminine energy, which tends towards the darker side, Marie's is definitely a lot towards the lighter side and ends up pretty wounded. But you have Dubarry, who really is embodying her like darker seductress feminine energy, and the king is absolutely mesmerized with her, wants to give her everything she wants her by his side. And one of the really interesting things is that when the king actually did get sick and it looked like he wasn't gonna live much longer, they needed to do all these, you know, last rites rituals. They needed to take his final confession, but as the priest said, he couldn't do that while the king had a mistress. So they had to send the mistress away in order for this to happen. So she couldn't be there with him on his final days. And I think it's really symbolic that the last thing that the king said that he wanted, like his last words before he passed, were asking for her. It was Dubarry. Like, he wanted her with him at his last moments. And I think that's so symbolic, because I think oftentimes we get caught up in this narrative that it's all about what a woman can do for a man. Like, how good a wife can a woman be for a man? Like, what can she do for him? Like, what are the checklists of things that a woman needs to do for him? Does she cook, clean? Is she the perfect wife? When in reality, the woman that a masculine man is gonna hang on to is the woman who is the most open and receptive to what he can do for her. The woman who is cultivating sexual energy with him, cultivating sensuality. The woman that is the reason why he gets up every day and wants to live a new day. Like, that's the woman that's going to stay with him until his last breath. Like, that's the woman he's going to think about for the rest of his life, is the woman that actually is his true feminine partner, in whatever sense that is. Like, you know, in this case, it was a very twisted situation. However, it is very symbolic of the fact that the masculine is not going to fall for the woman who does the most for him. A masculine man is going to fall in love with the woman who he is moved to do things for, because the masculine is a giving energy. He wants to provide, he wants to protect, and the woman that he feels the most drawn to do that for, who is the woman who's going to be bringing the most feminine energy to him in the form of sensuality, sexuality, openness, receptiveness, playfulness, joy, entertainment, all of these things, like bringing these things into his life that he is moved to then provide a wonderful life for her. Like, that's the even giving and receiving in the masculine and feminine, right? It's not about what can the feminine specifically do for the masculine. What is she bringing in her feminine energy to him that is inspiring him to want to do things for her? And how open and receptive is she to the things that he is bringing to her, the things that he is providing for her? That's the dynamic there. Like, that's the woman that the masculine is going to fall in love with. I don't know. I think this is really symbolic, and I'm not at all saying that you should necessarily be someone that everybody thinks was from a whorehouse or something like that, because I've mentioned this many times on this channel, I'm not an advocate of promiscuity for men or women. This idea that everybody has to have this sort of like perfect background, and that a woman has to be like perfectly polished, and that a woman needs to be, you know, the perfect housewife. Perfect and the feminine don't go together. Like they're not meant to be the same. Like you don't have to be the perfect anything. You just have to cultivate the feminine energy from within you and be the best version of that feminine energy within yourself. Heal your wounds, because the wounded feminine is going to be difficult for you, for everybody. So healing your wounds and fully connecting to your own natural core feminine energy, that is going to make you so magnetic to a masculine man. That's the woman that a masculine man is going to dedicate his life to for the rest of his life. And if he's not willing to do that, then maybe that's just not the man for you. I don't know, I mean, that was just a small little storyline in this movie, but I just thought that was really significant, the fact that her name was the last one on the king's lips. So yeah, aesthetically, this movie is absolutely stunning. It's decadent, like I said. I mean, it's kind of a love or hate kind of movie. I mean, the way that the movie was kind of made with the sort of more modern day music, but having like the period aesthetic and things like that. I mean, it's kind of a love or hate. But I did think this was a really beautiful example of seeing all of the feminine archetypes, some of them healed, some of them wounded, in one character transitioning throughout a film. So after you watch this video, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend that you watch it, see if you can pick up on some of the things that I mentioned. If you have any thoughts on this movie or any topics I mentioned in this video, or any other film suggestions or topic suggestions, let me know and leave a comment in the comment section below. I love to hear from you and I love your suggestions. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you are a woman I would like to connect to her feminine energy, I have online courses, details in the description box below with links to all my social media accounts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.